When an arrogant TV host mocks Shaq's necklace, he thinks he's setting up a viral moment. But he has no idea what's coming. With one powerful story, Shaq turns the tables so hard that the entire audience goes silent. By the time the interview ends, it's not Shaq who's embarrassed. It's the host whose career may never recover. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal had always been larger than life, in every possible way. Standing at 7 feet 1 inch, he was a tower of strength, but his heart was even bigger. Fans adored him not just for his dominance on the basketball court, but for his kindness, generosity, and humor. He was the man who quietly paid off strangers' bills, tipped waitresses more than they made in a month, and bought a new truck for a struggling father without a second thought. But Shaq wasn't just known for his giving nature. He was a man who carried himself with humility. Despite his wealth and status, he never looked down on anyone. He treated janitors the same way he treated billionaires. That was just who he was. So when a sleek black envelope arrived at his Florida mansion, inviting him to be a guest on the Graham Sinclair show, he didn't think much of it. Graham Sinclair was a household name, a sharp-tongued, immaculately dressed talk show host who thrived on controversy. His show wasn't just about entertainment, it was about provocation. He was known for putting guests in uncomfortable situations, pushing them to their limits, and, more often than not, making a fool out of them. Shaq had seen the clips before. Athletes, actors, even politicians. No one was safe from Graham's brand of sarcasm and smug superiority. Some guests handled it well, firing back with their own sharp wit. Others crumbled under the pressure, walking off mid-interview or becoming the butt of a viral joke. Shaq's agent, Landon Pierce, had reservations. He sat across from Shaq in his home office, flipping the invitation between his fingers, frowning. "Are you sure about this, big man?" Graham's got a reputation. Shaq leaned back in his leather chair, his massive hands clasped together. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what kind of show he was walking into, but he wasn't afraid. "I got nothing to hide," he said simply. "If he wants to play games, that's on him." Landon sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "All right, just be ready. This guy doesn't fight fair." Shaq chuckled. "I don't fight at all. That's the difference." With that, the decision was made. The interview was set for Friday evening, filmed live in front of a studio audience in New York City. As the day approached, Shaq went about his usual routine. Morning workouts, meetings with his business partners, and surprise visits to schools where he handed out shoes to kids who couldn't afford them. He wasn't thinking much about Graham Sinclair. But behind the scenes, the media was already buzzing. Sinclair's team was leaking teasers, promising an unfiltered conversation with one of basketball's biggest legends. On social media, speculation ran wild. What's Sinclair planning? Will he try to humiliate Shaq like he did with that football player last month? Shaq is too smooth for him. He's not going to fall for the trap. Even Shaq's friends reached out. Fellow athletes, Hollywood actors, and longtime reporters sent him messages of support and warning. But Shaq didn't let the noise get to him. He had no idea what Graham was up to. But he knew one thing. He wouldn't let a man like that shake him. The night before the interview, Shaq was sitting alone in his study, flipping through an old wooden box. Inside was a collection of items that meant something to him. Things that weren't worth millions but were priceless in sentiment. And there it was. A thick, diamond-encrusted necklace. One that stood out even in a room full of championship rings and rare memorabilia. He lifted it carefully, running a finger over the polished surface. This wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It was a reminder. A link to something painful, something powerful. He had received it decades ago, from someone who had once saved him from a moment that could have ended differently. A woman who had shown him that strength wasn't just about size. Shaq wasn't a man who wore flashy jewelry often, but this necklace was different. So the next morning, when he packed his bag for New York, he placed the necklace inside. A part of him had a feeling that he'd need it. The private jet landed at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey just after noon. A sleek black SUV was waiting for him, ready to take him into Manhattan. Shaq was used to the attention. Paparazzi snapping pictures, fans waving from behind barriers, the occasional reporter trying to sneak in a last-minute question. But this time, there was a different energy in the air. Reporters weren't just asking about basketball or his business ventures. They wanted to know about the interview. Shaq, are you nervous about facing Graham Sinclair? Do you think he's going to try and embarrass you? Are you ready for whatever he throws at you? Shaq just smiled, towering over the reporters as he slid into the SUV. Man, I've faced bigger challenges than Graham Sinclair. The ride to the studio was smooth, the streets of New York buzzing with their usual rhythm of life. He leaned back against the seat, gazing out at the skyline, mentally preparing. This wasn't just another interview. It was something more. He could feel it. When he arrived at the studio, a producer named Tyler Brinks greeted him with an overly enthusiastic smile. He was young, probably mid-30s, with a nervous energy that felt a little forced. "We're so excited to have you here, Shaq," Tyler said, leading him down the hallway. "Graham's been really looking forward to this." Shaq just nodded, his eyes scanning the space. The studio had that familiar talk show feel. Bright lights, a polished stage, a crowd of eager audience members waiting behind the curtains. Backstage, a makeup artist dusted his face with powder while another assistant clipped a mic to his jacket. Everything was moving fast, but Shaq was calm. Then, just before he was about to step onto the stage, he saw him. Graham Sinclair. The host stood near the entrance to the set, adjusting his tie in a mirror. He was tall, but nowhere near Shaq's size. Thin, sharp-featured, with a smirk that never quite left his face. When he turned and saw Shaq, that smirk widened. "Ah, the man of the hour," Graham said, extending a hand. "Looking forward to this, Shaq." Shaq shook his hand. It was a firm grip, but there was something behind it. A certain arrogance, like a man who thought he was already in control of the game before it even started. But Shaq had been in the game a long time. He wasn't worried about Graham Sinclair. He was just wondering what move he'd try first. Shaq arrived at the studio in his usual calm, unshaken demeanor. But today there was something different about him. Something noticeable even to those who had been around him for years. Around his thick neck rested a bold, diamond-studded necklace, glittering under the studio lights. It wasn't just another luxury piece. It wasn't for show. It was a statement, a silent reminder of something much deeper than wealth. As he walked through the backstage hallway, studio assistants and producers glanced at the necklace, some admiring it, others whispering to one another. It was an unusual accessory for Shaq, who rarely wore flashy jewelry. He was known for his larger-than-life presence, but his style was usually simple, expensive, sure, but understated. But tonight that necklace sat front and center. The chain itself was thick, the diamonds expertly set, but the real centerpiece was the pendant. It wasn't shaped like a basketball or a championship ring. It was a small, aged medallion encased in gold, with the words barely visible anymore. To most, it was just another ornament, but to Shaq, it carried a weight far heavier than gold. From the moment Shaq entered the green room, he felt it, eyes on him, watching, studying. Not the usual admiration he was used to, not the kind of attention a superstar naturally commanded. This was different. Graham Sinclair's people were assessing him, quietly exchanging glances, murmuring behind their hands. Something was brewing. Shaq had been in enough boardrooms, locker rooms, and negotiations to recognize when people were planning something. A young producer named Tyler Brinks approached him, holding a clipboard a little too tightly. His hands were clammy when he shook Shaq's hand. His eyes flickered toward the necklace for just a second, just long enough for Shaq to notice. "Looking sharp tonight, Shaq," Tyler said, forcing a smile. "That's, quite a necklace." Shaq simply nodded, not offering an explanation. He wasn't about to tell a stranger why he had chosen to wear it tonight. Tyler lingered for a moment before clearing his throat. "Graham's really excited for this interview," he continued, his voice holding a rehearsed ease. "He's got a great lineup of questions. Should be a lot of fun." Shaq didn't respond. He knew the kind of fun Graham had in mind. As the minutes ticked down before the interview, Shaq sat alone in the dressing room, staring at himself in the mirror. His fingers traced the pendant, feeling the cold metal against his skin. The memory came rushing back. He was 13. Tall for his age, already built like a future champion. But no amount of height or strength could protect a black boy walking through the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. It had been a hot summer day in Texas, the kind where the air clung to your skin. Shaq had been on his way home from basketball practice, his gym bag slung over his shoulder, his sneakers scraping against the sidewalk. He had been thinking about a Nike commercial he'd seen earlier that day, dreaming of the moment he'd have his own shoe deal. Then came the voices. "Hey boy, you lost?" He turned. 3 men. Grown men, not kids his age. Their expressions were twisted with something he was too young to fully understand, but old enough to fear. He didn't say anything. He just kept walking. His father had always told him, "Don't engage. Keep moving." But they didn't let him. They followed. Words turned to laughter. Laughter turned to threats. He remembered feeling his pulse thunder in his ears, the sudden realization that he was alone, that there was no coach, no teammate, no referee to blow a whistle and call for a timeout. And then she appeared. A woman stepped onto her front porch. A small, elderly black woman with silver hair tied in a scarf. She had the kind of presence that commanded respect without saying a word. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, calm, and strong. "Leave him be." The men hesitated. Then, one of them laughed under his breath, spat on the ground, and muttered something Shaq didn't catch. But they walked away. The woman had saved him. That day she sat him down on her porch, poured him a glass of sweet tea, and told him, "Baby, this world ain't always gonna be kind to you. But you remember this. You are bigger than their hate, bigger than their small minds. Keep walking, and don't you ever let them steal your greatness." Before he left, she pressed a small, worn medallion into his palm. It had been her father's, she told him, a man who had fought for his rights long before Shaq was born. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a symbol of protection, resilience, and history. Shaq had kept it ever since. Tonight, he wore it not just as a reminder of where he came from, but as a silent message, one he didn't need to explain to anyone. The knock on the dressing room door snapped Shaq out of his thoughts. It was time. As he walked toward the stage, he could already hear the audience settling in, the faint hum of pre-show chatter mixing with the sound of cameras being prepped. The floor manager gestured for him to take his position behind the curtain. On the other side of the set, Graham Sinclair was already seated, waiting with his signature smirk. Shaq caught sight of Graham's assistant whispering something into his earpiece. The host nodded, eyes flicking briefly to the necklace before refocusing on the stage. Shaq had been in enough games, interviews, and negotiations to recognize when someone had a plan, and he could see it written all over Graham's face. As he adjusted his jacket, Shaq felt a presence beside him. Landon Pierce, his agent, had managed to get backstage, despite the studio's restrictions. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Be careful out there, big man," Landon murmured. "They're up to something." Shaq didn't need the warning. He already knew. When the floor manager counted down, 3, 2, 1, Shaq stepped forward onto the stage. The lights hit him instantly, warm and blinding. The audience erupted into applause, a mix of excitement and respect. Shaq smiled, acknowledging them with his usual effortless charm. But as he approached the sleek leather chair opposite Graham Sinclair, he caught something. The briefest flicker of amusement in Graham's eyes. It wasn't the kind of smile that welcomed. It was the kind of smile that anticipated. And Shaq knew, without a doubt, this wasn't just going to be an interview. It was a setup. The studio lights burned bright, reflecting off the polished stage floor as the theme music of the Graham Sinclair show faded out. The crowd, still buzzing from the energy of the introduction, clapped enthusiastically as Shaquille O'Neal settled into his seat. His sheer presence dominated the space. Even with the imposing host sitting across from him, the contrast between their personalities was undeniable. One built his career on tearing people down, the other on lifting them up. Shaq leaned back in his chair, relaxed, his massive hands folded in his lap. Graham, on the other hand, perched forward, his signature smirk in place, eyes flickering with a mix of curiosity and something else. Something calculated. "Shaq," Graham began smoothly, his voice laced with manufactured warmth. "It is an honor to have you here tonight." Shaq nodded, his deep voice rumbling through the mic. "Appreciate it, man. Glad to be here." The audience clapped again, and for a brief moment, the interview felt like it might be just another casual conversation. Graham started with the usual questions. Shaq's transition from basketball to business, his work in philanthropy, the surprise acts of kindness that had turned him into a viral sensation. Shaq answered them all effortlessly, his charisma making it impossible not to like him. But there was something in Graham's eyes, a restless glint that betrayed his impatience. This wasn't what he wanted. He wasn't here to celebrate Shaq's success. He was here to poke, to product, to make headlines. And finally, he found his moment. Graham shifted in his chair, his smile widening just a fraction. "Now, I gotta say, Shaq," he mused, tapping his fingers against the desk. "I've interviewed a lot of legends, athletes, actors, billionaires, but man, that is some necklace." Shaq felt the energy in the room change. It was subtle, but it was there. The laughter from the audience was different this time. It wasn't the laughter that came from admiration or joy. It was the kind of laughter that came when people weren't sure whether they were in on the joke or about to become one. Shaq remained calm, offering a small smile. "Yeah, it's special to me." Graham leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, eyes glinting with amusement. "Special, huh? Well, I gotta say, didn't take you for the bling type." Another chuckle from the audience, this time more hesitant. Some people caught the undertone. Others were still waiting to see where this was going. Shaq didn't react right away. He let the moment breathe, his fingers brushing over the pendant almost unconsciously. "I don't really do jewelry like that," he admitted. "But this one means something." Graham tilted his head as if intrigued. But the audience knew better. The ones who had followed his career, the ones who had seen him do this exact routine before, knew he wasn't intrigued. He was circling. "Oh, come on," Graham said, grinning. "You gotta admit, it's a little flashy, don't you think? Diamonds, gold. Looks like it belongs in a rapper's music video, not around the neck of a humble guy like you." The way he said it, humble, like it was something to be questioned, something to be mocked, sent a ripple through the audience. Shaq exhaled slowly through his nose. His patience wasn't thin, but it wasn't endless either. He smiled, but there was something different behind it now. "See, I get what you're trying to do," Shaq said, his voice even. "And it's cool. You want to talk about the necklace? Let's talk about it." For the first time that night, Graham hesitated. It was just for a second, just long enough for the cameras to catch the shift in his posture. But it was there. He had expected Shaq to dodge, to laugh it off. He hadn't expected him to invite the conversation. But there was no turning back now. "Oh, absolutely," Graham said smoothly, regaining his footing. "Tell us. What's the story? Because I gotta say, it's not what I pictured a guy like you wearing." The emphasis on "a guy like you" hung in the air just long enough to be noticed. Shaq didn't react right away. He let the weight of the words settle before he spoke. "You know what, Graham?" he said finally. "That's exactly why I wore it tonight." The audience leaned in. They could feel it. The moment had changed. Shaq's voice was still calm, still steady, but there was a new presence behind it. A weight that turned the playful jabs into something far more significant. "This necklace," Shaq continued, holding it up so the pendant caught the light. "This was given to me by a woman who saved me when I was a kid. A woman who put herself between me and 3 men who thought I was in the wrong place, at the wrong time." The laughter in the audience was gone now. Graham's smirk flickered. Shaq let the silence stretch. He knew the power of a pause. "This necklace isn't just jewelry," he said. "It's a reminder of a time when I realized that being big didn't always mean I was safe." The audience wasn't breathing. Even the people in the control room had stopped whispering, their eyes glued to the monitors. Graham, for the first time in a long time, didn't seem to know what to say. But Shaq wasn't done. "I was 13, he continued, walking home from practice. 3 men, grown men, decided they didn't like seeing a kid like me in their neighborhood. They surrounded me, laughed, told me I didn't belong. A woman in the front row covered her mouth with her hands. They were about to put hands on me when she came outside," Shaq said, his voice steady. This little old woman didn't even hesitate. She looked them in the eye and told them to walk away. The audience was silent. Shaq leaned back, fingers still resting on the pendant. She gave me this necklace that day, he said. Told me to keep walking. Told me not to let people like that decide who I was going to be. Graham shuffled his cue cards. He wasn't smiling anymore. This wasn't the reaction he had planned for. He had wanted Shaq defensive, flustered, uncomfortable. Instead, he had handed him the most powerful moment of the entire interview. Shaq watched him, patient. I get it now, Graham said finally, forcing a chuckle, trying to regain some ground. Didn't mean to hit a nerve, big guy, just making conversation. Shaq smiled, slow and deliberate. Nah, he said. You meant to be funny. But you weren't. The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers. Graham gritted his teeth behind his smile, nodding as if he was in on the joke. But everyone in that room and everyone watching at home knew the truth. Shaq hadn't just answered his question. He had flipped the entire moment on its head. And Graham Sinclair? He had just lost control of his own show. A thin, calculated smirk tugged at the corner of Graham Sinclair's lips. He wasn't done. Not yet. The first jab had failed, and Shaq had turned it into a moment of power rather than weakness. But Graham had spent years in this business, and he knew how to push. He leaned forward, flipping his cue cards in a casual manner, but his eyes carried something sharp, something predatory. Shaq had been in games where opponents tried to get under his skin, but this wasn't competition. This was a setup. So, Graham began again, forcing out a chuckle. You're telling me that necklace is about humility? Because I gotta be honest, Shaq, most people would look at that and see something else. Shaq said nothing. He just watched, patient, unreadable. Graham took that as an opening. See, I think it's interesting, he continued, his voice dripping with feigned curiosity. You talk about struggle, about obstacles. But let's be real here, Shaq. You weren't exactly playing life on hard mode, were you? A murmur rippled through the audience. Shaq still didn't speak. You're what, 7'1", built like a tank? Graham gestured loosely toward him. You think people weren't lining up to hand you opportunities? Come on, man. Let's call it what it is. You hit the genetic lottery. You're not here because you fought your way up from nothing. You're here because nature stacked the deck in your favor. The murmurs turned uneasy. This wasn't the usual playful ribbing of a late-night interview. This was something else. Shaq knew this playbook. He had seen this argument before. The idea that his success wasn't earned, that he hadn't worked for it, that he was simply a lucky man cashing in on the hand he was dealt. He could feel the weight of the audience's expectations. They were waiting for him to react, to fire back, to let the tension crack open. Instead, Shaq simply breathed. Graham pressed on, mistaking silence for weakness. I mean, look at you now, he continued, shaking his head in mock disbelief. You've got it all. Businesses, sponsorships, a fortune big enough to buy half the city. But you still want to wear a necklace like that? What are you proving, Shaq? That you can dress like the guys who rap about money and girls while you sit on your millions? The laughter was barely there this time. Forced, uncomfortable. The audience wasn't sure if they were supposed to laugh or if something was truly wrong. Graham noticed the shift. He had miscalculated, but he was too deep now. He had to keep going. Shaq could feel the cameras locked onto him. Every movement, every breath, every expression was being analyzed, dissected, broadcasted. He didn't flinch, didn't change his expression, didn't give Graham the reaction he was fishing for. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the chair, his fingers lightly brushing the pendant on his necklace. I hear you, he said finally, his voice low and steady. You think I didn't work for this? Graham shrugged, clearly pleased to have finally pulled something out of him. I think you got lucky, he said plainly. Shaq nodded as if considering the words. Then he chuckled softly, but it wasn't amusement. You know what's funny? He said, tilting his head slightly. People love saying that it was all genetics, all luck. Like I woke up one day 7 feet tall holding a contract in my hands. Graham gave a dismissive wave. I mean, Shaq didn't let him finish. Do you know what it's like to be a kid who doesn't fit in any room? He asked, his voice still calm but now edged with something deeper. To be bigger than your own father by the time you're 13? To have people look at you not like a child, but like a threat? The audience was dead silent. Graham's smirk was gone. You want to talk about luck? Shaq continued. Luck would have been having a childhood where I wasn't constantly reminded that I was different. Luck would have been not being told at 8 years old that I had to be careful just walking down the street because my size meant people would assume I was dangerous. Graham shifted, but he had no room to interrupt. You sit there and tell me I had it easy because I was big, Shaq said, his voice steady. But what you don't understand, what you'll never understand, is that being big never protected me from the things people didn't want to see. He tapped the pendant once, just once. This necklace, he said, it's a reminder, not of money, not of fame. It's a reminder of a time when I was told to keep my head down and survive, while people like you sat in places like this, making sure the world believed that success only belonged to the people who looked like you. A sharp inhale ran through the audience. Graham's face flushed slightly, but he forced a smirk back onto his lips. Whoa, he said, hands up in mock surrender. Shaq, come on, man. I think you're taking this a little too personally. Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Nah, he said, sitting back. I'm just telling you what you didn't want to hear. For the first time in his career, Graham Sinclair was losing control. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. The energy had changed, and there was no way to spin it back into a joke. He had overstepped, and everyone in the room felt it. Social media was already exploding. Clips of the interview were going viral in real time. Shaq just ended Graham Sinclair's whole career on live TV. Graham tried to embarrass Shaq, and now he's the one sweating. This is what happens when you underestimate someone with real intelligence. Graham glanced toward the producer's booth, as if waiting for someone to save him. But there was nothing they could do. The control room had already cut to commercial break. The second the cameras went off, Graham stood up quickly, yanking off his mic pack, muttering something under his breath. He wouldn't look at Shaq. But Shaq? Shaq didn't move. He just sat there, relaxed, while the energy crumbled around him. Landon Pierce, Shaq's agent, was already waiting backstage, shaking his head in amusement. That, Landon murmured as Shaq approached, was the smoothest takedown I've ever seen. Shaq just chuckled, adjusting the pendant one last time before stepping out into the blazing lights of the hallway. He had walked into Graham's game, but he had left with something far more powerful. Graham had tried to make him the punchline. Instead, Shaq had turned the entire interview into a moment no one would ever forget. The energy in the studio had shifted. Moments ago, Graham Sinclair had been poking, prodding, trying to push Shaq into a corner. The host had thrown every loaded question, every passive-aggressive remark he could manage, hoping to rattle him, to get a reaction that would turn into a viral, headline-making moment. But now, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the studio lights. Shaq wasn't angry. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't playing into Graham's game. Instead, he did something no one expected. He leaned forward, not in aggression, not in defense, but with a presence so steady, so undeniable, that even Graham Sinclair felt it. Shaq's fingers brushed against the necklace, the weight of it, the history in it. And then he spoke. You want to know the story behind this? His voice was low, steady. Graham didn't respond. He didn't need to. The question wasn't really for him anymore. It was for the audience, for the millions watching at home, for everyone who had ever understood what it meant to carry something heavier than gold. Shaq took a breath, his eyes distant for just a moment, as if he had been pulled back through time. I was 13 years old, he said, living in Texas. The crowd was silent now, hanging onto every word. I was already big back then, he continued. 6'6" at 13. People looked at me and didn't see a kid. They saw something else. His fingers tightened around the pendant. One afternoon, I was walking home from practice, he said, his voice steady. Had my gym bag over my shoulder, sneakers scraping against the sidewalk. Wasn't thinking about anything serious. Just wanted to get home. get some food, maybe watch TV for a while. A pause. Then I heard them. The audience leaned in. Shaq's eyes stayed on the pendant as he spoke. 3 men. Grown men. Not kids. Not teenagers. Men who should have had better things to do than stop a 13-year-old on the street. The tension in the room was palpable now. They started talking, Shaq said. Asking me where I was going, like I didn't belong, like I was in their space. He shook his head, just slightly. They weren't asking because they wanted an answer. They were asking because they wanted a reason. A murmur rippled through the audience, but no one dared interrupt. I didn't say anything, Shaq continued. I did what my father taught me, kept walking, didn't engage, didn't give them a reason. He let out a slow breath, but it didn't matter. They followed, he said simply. Started laughing, started mocking. One of them said something about how I was too big to be so scared. A sharp inhale came from somewhere in the audience. Shaq's voice didn't rise. He didn't change his tone. But the weight of what he was saying pressed down on the entire room. They didn't care that I was a kid, didn't care that I wasn't doing anything. They had already decided what I was, and they were waiting for me to mess up. He shook his head. I don't know what would have happened if she hadn't stepped outside. A few people in the audience visibly tensed. Graham Sinclair sat perfectly still. Shaq looked up then, his gaze sweeping across the room, his voice strong, unwavering. There was a house on the corner, small place, little porch, flower pots everywhere. And out walked this woman, small, older, maybe in her 70s. Had this silver hair tucked up in a scarf, didn't raise her voice, didn't yell. Just stepped out onto her porch and said, real calm. Leave him be. The room was motionless. Shaq exhaled slowly. And they did. A few audience members blinked, stunned. She didn't know me, he said. Didn't owe me anything, but she stepped in anyway. He let the words settle. Graham wasn't smirking anymore. Shaq lifted the pendant slightly. Before I left, she called me over, he said. Sat me down on her porch, gave me a glass of sweet tea like I was her grandson or something. And she told me, real quiet, baby, this world ain't always gonna be kind to you. But you keep walking, you keep your head up, don't you ever let them steal your greatness. A few people in the audience wiped their eyes. Shaq nodded toward the necklace. Then she gave me this, he said. Told me it had been her father's. Said it had protected him in hard times and she wanted me to have it. His fingers brushed over the pendant once more. This, he said, voice soft but firm. This ain't about money. This ain't about showing off. A pause. This is a promise. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence that said everything. Shaq let the room sit in it. Graham Sinclair, who had spent his entire career controlling the narrative, looked like a man completely out of his depth. Finally, after what felt like a full minute of silence, he cleared his throat. Well, Shaq, Graham said, forcing a tight chuckle. That's quite a story. His voice wasn't as steady as before. Shaq just smiled. Not in amusement, not in triumph. Just in knowing. Yeah, he said. It is. The audience erupted into applause, but it wasn't the usual kind. It wasn't polite or rehearsed. It was genuine, raw. Something had changed in that studio. And Graham Sinclair knew it. Graham Sinclair was drowning, and he knew it. He sat in his chair, shoulders just a little stiffer than before, fingers twitching against the cue cards in his lap. His usual smug confidence had cracked, just enough for the cameras to catch it. And the worst part? He could feel it happening in real time. The energy in the room had shifted completely. The audience, once cautiously entertained by his jabs and sarcasm, was now firmly on Shaq's side. Even those who had come just to watch the spectacle, those who had expected another classic Sinclair takedown, couldn't deny what had just happened. Shaq had spoken with truth, with depth, with something real. And Graham? Graham had nothing. He forced a chuckle, shaking his head as if trying to brush the moment away, like it was just another light-hearted exchange. Well, damn, Shaq, he said, forcing the smirk back onto his face. Didn't realize we were doing story time tonight. No laughter. Not from the audience. Not from the crew. Not from anyone. It wasn't just silence. It was the kind of silence that suffocated. Shaq didn't even react. He just watched, unbothered, letting Graham sit in the weight of his own failure. Graham tried again, his voice a little tighter now. I mean, come on, people. He gestured toward the audience, as if pleading for them to get back on his side. We all love a good underdog story, right? Still, nothing. Just the cold realization setting in. The audience wasn't with him anymore. What Graham didn't know, what he couldn't possibly control, was that the moment had already left the studio. While he was scrambling to fix his sinking ship, social media was catching fire. On Twitter, clips from the show were being posted at lightning speed. This is what happens when you underestimate someone with real wisdom. Graham tried to humiliate Shaq, and Shaq turned it into one of the most powerful moments I've ever seen on live TV. You can feel the second Graham realizes he lost the audience. Brutal. The views were racking up by the second. TikTok was already flooded with breakdowns of the exchange. People were freezing frames, zooming in on Graham's face when the room turned on him. Even celebrities started chiming in. This is why you respect greatness. A-list actor, Shaq is a king. Graham played himself. Famous athlete. Back in the control room, the show's producers were in full panic mode. One of them, a middle-aged executive with sweat forming at his temples, leaned forward, watching the monitors in disbelief. This isn't good, he muttered to no one in particular. Another producer, a younger guy with a Bluetooth earpiece, was already scrolling through Twitter. His face paled as he read the responses. Guys? He said, his voice strained. This is blowing up, and not in a good way. They had seen viral moments before. They counted on them. But this wasn't the kind of viral moment that boosted ratings. This was the kind that buried careers. They needed an out. Fast. On stage, Graham was still trying to salvage the interview. He straightened in his chair, pasting on that fake TV smile, acting as if everything was fine. All right, he said, waving his hands. Let's move on, yeah? I mean, you've got a pretty insane business empire, Shaq. How about we talk about that instead? It was a weak pivot, and everyone knew it. Shaq just shook his head, amused. Nah, he said simply. I think we're good. The crowd cheered. It wasn't just a response. It was a verdict. Graham had lost. And Shaq? Shaq had just walked away the winner without ever having to throw a punch. It happened just before the show cut to commercial. Graham glanced toward the audience one last time, scanning the faces. Not a single one was on his side anymore. No nervous laughter, no sympathy, just cold indifference. For a man like Graham, who thrived on being the smartest, the funniest, the most dominant presence in the room, this was his worst nightmare. And as the cameras faded to black, he finally understood what had happened. He had tried to humiliate a legend, and instead, he had humiliated himself. The moment the interview ended, the storm began. Even before the cameras had fully cut to black, audience members were already pulling out their phones, their fingers moving fast across screens, sending texts, uploading clips, and sharing their reactions in real time. But by the time Shaq had stepped backstage and Graham had retreated to his dressing room, the real explosion had started. On the internet. Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, all of them lit up like wildfire. Someone in the crowd had uploaded the first clip barely minutes after the show ended. It was simple, a zoomed-in shot of Graham's face right when the audience turned on him. The caption? This is the exact moment Graham realized he messed up. The video was everywhere within an hour. Retweets skyrocketed. Quote tweets roasted Graham mercilessly. People slowed the footage down, replaying it over and over, dissecting every second of his downfall. Then came the full segment of Shaq's speech. It hit YouTube first. Someone had clipped the entire exchange, from Graham's snide remark about the necklace to Shaq's calm, commanding response. The comments exploded. Shaq just gave a masterclass in shutting down arrogance. Graham tried to play games, but Shaq played chess. This is what happens when you underestimate a legend. Within 3 hours, the video was trending #1, and that was just the beginning. Shaq's moment wasn't just viral, it had resonated. Soon, big names started chiming in. Athletes, actors, activists, all standing with Shaq. NBA players posted clips of the interview with captions like, "Respect the legend." Hip-hop artists called Graham out for his ignorance and arrogance. Even Hollywood actors shared their thoughts, praising Shaq for how he handled it. Then came the biggest endorsement of all, a tweet from a civil rights icon. Wisdom, strength, dignity. Shaquille O'Neal didn't just win an argument tonight. He reminded the world that grace is more powerful than arrogance. That single tweet was retweeted hundreds of thousands of times. By midnight, the hashtag number Respect Shaq was trending worldwide. While Shaq was being celebrated, Graham Sinclair was drowning. He had spent his entire career crafting an image of himself as a fearless, sharp-witted host, a man who wasn't afraid to challenge guests, who took pride in asking tough questions. But now the public wasn't buying it. The internet wasn't calling him fearless. They were calling him a coward, a bully, a man who finally got outclassed. And it wasn't just the audience turning against him. The media smelled blood. Headlines started rolling in. Graham Sinclair finally meets his match, and it's glorious. Shaq's interview is the most satisfying TV moment of the year. When arrogance fails, the night Graham Sinclair lost everything. Reporters reached out for comment, but Graham stayed silent, at first. Then, about 6 hours after the show aired, he made his move. Graham's PR team must have worked overtime to put together his response, because just before dawn, he released a statement on Twitter. It wasn't an apology. Instead, it was a defensive rant. In today's world, if you challenge someone even slightly, you get attacked. We're living in an age where cancel culture is trying to silence free speech. It's disappointing, but I won't apologize for doing my job. It was the worst thing he could have said. The internet tore him apart. Cancel culture? Bro, you embarrassed yourself. Shaq wasn't even mad. He just outclassed you. If cancel culture was real, you wouldn't have had a career in the first place. Even some of Graham's past guests, people who had once defended him, started calling him out. A former NBA star tweeted, "Graham's whole career was built on disrespect. Now that he finally got a taste of it himself, he's crying." A famous actress posted, "Watching Graham Sinclair get humbled in real time was the best thing I've seen all year." It wasn't just fans turning on him, it was his own industry. While Graham scrambled to control the damage, Shaq did something brilliant. He did nothing. No Twitter post, no interviews, no responses. He didn't have to say anything. His silence spoke louder than words. He went about his normal routine. He spent the day visiting a children's hospital, handing out sneakers to kids, laughing with fans. And of course, the cameras followed. A journalist managed to get close enough to ask, "Shaq, do you have any response to Graham's tweet?" Shaq smiled, shook his head, and simply said, "Man, I got better things to do." The internet went wild. By the next day, things only got worse for Graham. Sponsors started distancing themselves. A major network canceled an upcoming interview special with him. His usual defenders in the media went quiet. Then came the final blow. Late that evening, a source from within Graham's own show leaked something massive. His producers were already discussing replacing him. It wasn't official yet, but the network was panicking. Shaq's moment had damaged Graham Sinclair's brand beyond repair. And now, he was no longer an asset. He was a liability. The internet moved fast, but some moments stuck forever. The clip of Shaq's response was still trending, still being shared millions of times. People weren't just praising him for what he said. They were praising him for how he said it. No shouting, no anger, no insults, just wisdom, confidence, and truth. And Graham? He had spent his career trying to break people on live television. But in the end, he was the one who got broken. Days had passed since the interview, but its impact still echoed everywhere. The internet was relentless. Graham Sinclair's reputation had taken a massive hit, and the conversation hadn't died down. Every news outlet, podcast, and social media platform dissected what had happened. Memes flooded Twitter. Late-night hosts cracked jokes at his expense. Celebrities continued to throw their support behind Shaq. And Graham? For the first time in his career, he had no control over the narrative. He had tried to fight back, blaming cancel culture and overly sensitive audiences. But that strategy had failed miserably. The more he tried to justify himself, the worse it got. His sponsors had gone quiet, his own network was reconsidering his future, and even longtime supporters were distancing themselves. But then, something unexpected happened. Graham reached out to Shaq. Shaq was in Atlanta when the call came in. He was in the middle of a charity event, handing out backpacks and sneakers to kids at an elementary school, when his phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it, but something told him to pick up. "Shaq," came the voice on the other end. Tense, hesitant, different. There was a pause. "It's Graham." Shaq didn't say anything at first. He wasn't angry. He hadn't been angry that night. But he was surprised. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you," Shaq finally said, his voice calm. "I know," Graham admitted. I needed to say something. Not on TV, not on social media, just to you." Shaq waited. There was a deep breath on the other end. Then, "I messed up." Graham's words came slowly at first, like he wasn't sure how to say them. But then, once he started, he didn't stop. "I didn't expect it to go down like that," he admitted. "I didn't expect you to handle it the way you did. I thought it would be just another segment. Another moment where I poke a little, the guest gets defensive, and we move on." Shaq stayed silent. He could hear the weight in Graham's voice now. This wasn't just about damage control. This was deeper. "For years," Graham continued, "I told myself that my job was to push people, to get under their skin. That's how I built my brand. That's what my producers wanted. That's what got me ratings." There was another pause. "But that night, when you started talking about that woman, the woman who saved you as a kid, I realized something, Shaq. I realized that I wasn't pushing for truth. I was pushing for entertainment, at anyone's expense." For the first time, Graham's voice wasn't laced with arrogance or sarcasm. It was raw. "I watched that interview back more times than I can count," he admitted. "And I hated what I saw. Not just because the world turned on me. Not just because I became a joke. But because," he exhaled sharply, "because I saw who I really was." Shaq listened carefully. He had been in the spotlight long enough to know when someone was apologizing because they wanted redemption, and when they were apologizing because they truly meant it. And Graham, for the first time in his career, he sounded like a man who was telling the truth. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Graham said finally. "And I know this doesn't fix anything. But I don't want to be that guy anymore, Shaq. I don't want my legacy to be that." There was a pause. "I want to do better." Shaq thought about it for a moment. Then, in his deep, steady voice, he asked, "You serious about that?" "Yes," Graham said immediately. "I don't know what that looks like yet, but I know I need to start somewhere." Shaq considered that. Then, after a long moment, he made a decision. "Meet me," he said. 3 days later, they sat face to face again. But this time, there were no cameras, no audience, no staged production. Just a quiet hotel lounge, 2 cups of coffee, and a conversation that neither of them had ever expected to have. For the first 20 minutes, Graham just listened. He listened as Shaq talked about his experiences, his upbringing, the moments of racism and prejudice that had shaped him. He listened as Shaq explained that success didn't erase the realities of being black in America. Then, Graham spoke. He talked about his own past, about how early in his career he had been pressured into being the edgy, fearless host, how producers had pushed him to go harder, to be more ruthless, to never back down. He had told himself it was just a persona, just a role. But now he realized that at some point the persona had become real. "What do you want, Graham?" Shaq finally asked. Graham sighed. "I want to change." Shaq studied him carefully. "Then do it." Graham swallowed hard. "How?" Shaq leaned forward, his voice firm. "Start listening. Start owning your mistakes. And most importantly, use your platform for something real." It was a simple challenge, but it was the only one that mattered. A week later, a clip appeared online. It wasn't from the Graham Sinclair show. It was a simple, unedited one-on-one conversation. Shaq and Graham sitting together, talking about race, privilege, responsibility, and redemption. And this time, there were no cheap shots, no arrogance, no games, just truth. The internet didn't know what to do with it at first. Some people were skeptical, some thought it was just PR, but then they watched, and they saw something real. By the end of the interview, Graham Sinclair had done something he had never done before. He had admitted that he had been wrong. The world didn't forgive Graham overnight. He had spent years being one kind of person, and one interview wasn't going to erase that. But for the first time, he wasn't hiding behind excuses. He wasn't blaming the internet. He was trying. And Shaq had done what he always did. He had taken a moment that could have been just another scandal, another TV disaster, and he had turned it into something bigger, something that actually mattered. Because in the end, Shaq didn't just walk away winning a debate. He walked away changing a man. The moment between Shaq and Graham had passed, but the impact was just beginning. It wasn't just another viral TV moment, the kind that fades in a few weeks. This wasn't about drama, controversy, or another celebrity downfall. This was different. For the first time, a conversation that rarely made it past private circles was now unfolding in the public eye, on news stations, social media, and living rooms across the country. People weren't just talking about what happened, they were talking about why it mattered. Shaq didn't speak on it much after the interview. He didn't need to. The world was already talking. Everywhere, people were breaking down what had happened. Commentators weren't just dissecting Graham's embarrassment. They were diving into the deeper issue. This isn't just about a TV host being humbled, one journalist wrote. It's about a bigger truth. The way Black success is constantly questioned, downplayed, or treated as a fluke. Athletes, actors, and activists continued to speak out. Some shared their own experiences, moments when they had been disrespected, dismissed, or expected to tolerate thinly veiled racism under the guise of just a joke. The way Shaq handled that interview, an NBA player tweeted, "That's what grace under pressure looks like. That's what knowing your worth looks like." It was no longer just about Shaq. It was about every Black athlete who had been told their success was just genetics. It was about every person who had been told they didn't belong somewhere. It was about every moment of quiet dignity that had gone unnoticed, until now. Shaq had never been the type to chase headlines. He had built his legacy on action, not words. And this time, he made sure the moment meant something. Within weeks, Shaq used the renewed attention to amplify voices fighting discrimination. He made generous donations to civil rights organizations. He appeared on podcasts and in interviews, not to talk about Graham, but to talk about the bigger issue. And most importantly, he listened. He sat down with young activists, educators, and historians. He brought their voices to his platform, ensuring that the conversation didn't just stop with him. It wasn't about shaming Graham Sinclair. It was about creating real change. Meanwhile, Graham's network was forced to rethink everything. For years, they had encouraged the kind of behavior that led to that disastrous interview. They had thrived on shock value, controversy, and viral moments. But now, they were watching public figures be held accountable in real time. Graham's interview had been a turning point, not just for him, but for the industry. People were tired of arrogance being disguised as honest journalism. And the network, they had to decide whether they were going to evolve or be left behind. One evening, weeks after everything had unfolded, Shaq sat alone in his home office. The noise had died down. The news cycle had moved on. But some things stayed. He leaned back in his chair, fingers lightly tracing the pendant that had been at the center of it all. The necklace. The weight of it felt different now. It wasn't just a reminder of the past. It had become a symbol of something even bigger. He thought about the woman who had given it to him all those years ago. Her small frame, her quiet strength, the way she had stood up for him without hesitation. Shaq closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the sound of her voice. "Baby, this world ain't always going to be kind to you. But you keep walking. You keep your head up. Don't you ever let them steal your greatness." She had been right. And now the world knew exactly who he was. Not just a basketball legend, not just a businessman, but a man who refused to be shaken by small minds. The final lesson of that night wasn't about Graham Sinclair's downfall. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about what real strength looks like. Strength isn't shouting the loudest. It isn't meeting arrogance with arrogance. It's standing firm. It's knowing your worth. It's understanding that dignity will always outlast disrespect. And as Shaq let the necklace rest against his chest, he knew. This wasn't just about him. This was bigger than basketball. Some moments aren't just entertainment. They spark conversations that need to happen. What happened on that stage was bigger than an interview. It was a reminder of who gets questioned, who gets dismissed, and who refuses to back down. So ask yourself, when the moment comes, will you stand firm or stay silent? Because the next story that changes everything might be yours.